Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that's been completely misrepresented in every Western movie you've ever seen. We're talking about Wild West saloons, but not the gunfights, not the poker games, not the showdowns at high noon. Tonight, we're talking about the food. The actual real food that people ate in these establishments. And let me tell you, it wasn't what you think. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world slow down around you. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You walk into a saloon in Dodge City, Kansas in 1876. You're dusty from the trail, hungry, exhausted. You belly up to the bar expecting, what? A nice steak? Some fresh vegetables? Maybe a cold beer and a hot meal like you'd get at a modern restaurant? Wrong. What you're about to get is a reality check served on a tin plate with a side of disappointment. The food in Wild West saloons was nothing like what Hollywood shows you. There were no pristine kitchens, no skilled chefs, no health inspections. What there was survival. Cheap, filling, often questionable food designed to keep you alive and keep you drinking. Because that's what saloons really were, drinking establishments that happened to serve food, not restaurants that happened to serve alcohol. The free lunch, that staple of saloon culture, wasn't free at all. It was a marketing scheme, a way to get you in the door and keep you buying drinks. And the food itself? It was salty, it was greasy, it was designed to make you thirsty so you'd order another whiskey, another beer, another round. Tonight we're going to explore what people really ate in Wild West saloons. Not the sanitized version, not the romanticized Hollywood version, but the gritty, often disgusting truth. We're going to talk about the free lunch counters piled with mystery meat and stale bread. We're going to discuss the oysters, yes oysters, that were somehow available in the middle of the desert. We're going to explore the beans, the endless beans, and why they were the foundation of frontier cuisine. And by the end, you're going to understand why eating in a Wild West saloon was less about enjoying a meal and more about not starving to death while you drank yourself into oblivion. Let's start with the most famous aspect of saloon food, the free lunch. This was a real thing, not a Hollywood invention. Saloons across the American West offered free food to anyone who bought a drink. Sounds great, right? Free food? What's not to love? Everything. Everything is not to love. The free lunch wasn't an act of generosity. It was a calculated business strategy designed to maximize alcohol sales. The concept was simple. Offer free food that's so salty, so spicy, so thirst-inducing that customers have to keep buying drinks. The food was free, but the drinks weren't, and the drinks were where saloons made their money. The free lunch counter was typically a long table or bar set up in the saloon, covered with various dishes. And when I say various dishes, I mean a collection of foods that ranged from barely edible to actively dangerous. Let's talk about what you'd actually find there. First, there was bread, but not fresh bread. Not the kind of bread you'd want to eat. This was day-old bread, sometimes week-old bread, hard as a rock and dry as dust. It was there to fill you up cheaply, to give you something to chew on while you drank. Some saloons would soak the bread in beer or water to make it softer, which sounds nice until you realize that the beer was probably flat and the water was probably contaminated. Then there were the pickles. Pickles were everywhere on free lunch counters because they were cheap, they lasted forever, and they were incredibly salty. Eating a pickle made you thirsty. Eating 3 pickles made you desperately thirsty. And when you're desperately thirsty in a saloon, you buy another drink. The pickles weren't there to complement your meal. They were there to sell whiskey. Cheese was another staple, but not good cheese. This was cheap, hard cheese that had been sitting out for hours or days. It was often covered in a layer of grease or wax to keep it from drying out completely. You'd cut off a chunk with a communal knife that everyone used, and you'd eat it with your fingers because plates and utensils were in short supply. The communal aspect of free lunch is important to understand. This wasn't individual servings. This was everyone eating from the same dishes, using the same utensils, touching the same food. Hygiene wasn't a concept that had reached the frontier yet. If you were squeamish about germs, about other people's hands in your food, about the general uncleanliness of the whole operation, you didn't eat at the free lunch counter. Sausages were common, hanging from hooks or piled on plates. But these weren't artisanal sausages made from quality meat. These were mystery tubes filled with whatever meat scraps the butcher couldn't sell, mixed with fat, salt, and spices to hide the taste. You didn't ask what was in the sausage. You just ate it and hoped for the best. Some saloons offered what they called sardines, which were actually small fish preserved in oil or brine. These were incredibly salty and fishy, and they came in tins that had been shipped from the coast. By the time they reached a saloon in the middle of Kansas or Colorado, they'd been sitting in those tins for months. The oil was rancid, the fish were mushy, but they were protein, and protein was valuable on the frontier. Hard-boiled eggs were another free lunch staple. These were eggs that had been boiled, sometimes days earlier, and left sitting out. They were often pickled in vinegar and spices, which helped preserve them and made them even saltier. You'd grab an egg, peel it with your dirty fingers, and eat it while standing at the bar. The shells would fall on the floor, mixing with the sawdust and tobacco spit that covered every saloon floor. And then there was the meat. Oh, the meat. This is where things get really questionable. Saloons would offer various types of meat on their free lunch counters: ham, beef, pork, sometimes game meat like venison or rabbit. But this wasn't fresh meat. This was meat that had been salted, smoked, dried, or otherwise preserved because refrigeration didn't exist. The meat was often so salty that it was almost inedible. You'd take a bite and immediately need a drink, which was, of course, the point. The salt preserved the meat, but it also served the saloon's business model perfectly. Every bite of that ham made you thirstier, made you order another beer, made the saloon more money. Some of the meat was questionable in origin. In a frontier town where food was scarce and expensive, you didn't ask too many questions about where the meat came from. Was it beef? Was it horse? Was it something else entirely? You ate it and tried not to think about it too hard. The quality of the free lunch varied wildly depending on the saloon. In a prosperous town with competition between saloons, the free lunch might be relatively decent. Saloons would try to outdo each other, offering better food to attract more customers. In San Francisco, for example, some saloons offered elaborate free lunches with multiple dishes, trying to appeal to the city's growing middle class. But in a small frontier town with only one or two saloons, the free lunch was whatever the saloon owner felt like putting out. And what he felt like putting out was usually the cheapest, saltiest, most thirst-inducing food he could find. There were rules for the free lunch, unwritten, but universally understood. You had to buy a drink to access the food. You couldn't just walk in, eat, and leave. That would get you thrown out, possibly violently. You were expected to buy at least one drink, preferably more, and then you could eat as much as you wanted from the free lunch counter. But as much as you wanted came with social pressure. If you were clearly just there for the free food, if you weren't drinking much but were eating a lot, you'd be judged. Other customers would look at you with contempt. The bartender might refuse to serve you. You were expected to maintain the fiction that you were there to drink, and the food was just a bonus, even if everyone knew you were hungry and the food was the main attraction. Some men survived on free lunch. Cowboys between jobs, drifters, men down on their luck. They'd nurse a single beer for as long as possible while eating as much as they could from the free lunch counter. It was a way to get a meal when you had almost no money. A nickel beer and all the food you could eat was a better deal than anything else available in most frontier towns. But this survival strategy came with a cost to your dignity. Everyone knew what you were doing. Everyone knew you were poor, desperate, barely scraping by. The free lunch was there for everyone, but it was really there for the desperate, and using it marked you as such. The free lunch also created a strange social dynamic. Rich and poor, cowboys and businessmen, all eating from the same counter, all touching the same food. In theory, it was democratic, egalitarian. In practice, it was uncomfortable. The wealthy men would eat quickly and move away. The poor men would linger, eating as much as they could. The social divisions were obvious even as everyone pretended they didn't exist. And the food itself, even when it was relatively fresh and well prepared, was designed for one purpose: to make you drink. Every dish was calculated to increase thirst. The salt, the spices, the grease, all of it was there to sell alcohol. The free lunch wasn't free. You paid for it with every drink you bought, and the saloon made sure you bought plenty. If there's one food that defined the Wild West, it was beans. Not steak, not buffalo, not fresh vegetables. Beans. Endless, monotonous, life-sustaining beans. Beans were the foundation of frontier cuisine for several very practical reasons. They were cheap. They were portable. They lasted forever. They provided protein and calories, and they could be cooked with minimal equipment and skill. For cowboys, miners, settlers, and saloon owners, beans were the answer to the constant question of how to feed people in a place where food was scarce and expensive. The most common type of beans in the Wild West were pinto beans, though navy beans, black beans, and kidney beans were also used. These dried beans could be transported in sacks, stored for months or years without spoiling, and cooked in large batches to feed many people. But cooking beans properly requires time and attention. You have to soak them overnight to soften them. You have to cook them for hours until they're tender. You have to season them properly, or they're bland and unappetizing. And in a saloon, where the priority was serving drinks, not preparing elaborate meals, beans were often cooked poorly. The typical saloon bean preparation went something like this. Take a large pot, fill it with beans and water, add salt pork or bacon for flavor, put it on the stove and let it simmer for hours, adding water as needed. When the beans were soft enough to eat, they were done. No careful seasoning, no attention to texture, just beans cooked until they were edible. The result was a pot of beans that was filling but not particularly delicious. The beans were mushy, the broth was thin and greasy, and the flavor was dominated by salt and pork fat. But it was hot, it was filling, and it was available, which made it better than nothing. Saloons would keep a pot of beans on the stove all day, serving them to anyone who wanted them. Sometimes they were part of the free lunch. Sometimes they cost a few cents for a bowl. Either way, they were a staple, something you could count on finding in almost any saloon in the West. The beans were served in bowls or on tin plates, often with a piece of cornbread or a biscuit. You'd eat them with a spoon, standing at the bar or sitting at a table if the saloon had tables. The beans were hot, which was a blessing in cold weather and a curse in hot weather, but you ate them anyway because they were food, and food was valuable. Cowboys had a complicated relationship with beans. On one hand, beans were reliable. You knew what you were getting. They filled you up and gave you energy for the hard physical labor of ranch work. On the other hand, beans were boring. Eating beans every day, sometimes multiple times a day, was monotonous. Cowboys dreamed of variety, of fresh meat, of vegetables, of anything that wasn't beans. But beans were what they got. On cattle drives, the chuck wagon cook would make beans almost every day. In bunkhouses, beans were a staple. And in saloons, beans were always available. You couldn't escape them. They were the soundtrack of frontier life, the constant background presence that everyone accepted but nobody loved. The monotony of beans led to creative attempts to make them more interesting. Some cooks would add chili peppers, creating what we'd now recognize as chili con carne. Others would add tomatoes, onions, or whatever vegetables were available. Some would add molasses or brown sugar for sweetness. These variations were appreciated, but they were rare. Most of the time, beans were just beans, cooked with salt pork, seasoned with salt, and served hot. The digestive consequences of a bean-heavy diet were significant and unavoidable. Beans cause gas. Everyone knows this. And when you're eating beans every day, when everyone around you is eating beans every day, the result is a constant pervasive flatulence that was just accepted as part of life. Cowboys joked about it. They made up songs about it. They complained about it. But they kept eating beans because there was no alternative. The discomfort, the embarrassment, the sheer unpleasantness of the digestive issues caused by constant bean consumption, these were just part of the price of survival on the frontier. Saloons, with their poor ventilation and crowded conditions, were particularly affected. The smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and spilled alcohol was bad enough. Add in the digestive consequences of everyone eating beans, and you have an olfactory nightmare. But people got used to it. They had to. There was no escaping it. The nutritional value of beans was significant, though nobody at the time understood nutrition the way we do now. Beans provided protein, fiber, iron, and other nutrients that were essential for health. In a diet that was often lacking in variety and fresh foods, beans helped prevent malnutrition and kept people functioning. But beans alone weren't enough. You needed other foods to round out your diet, to provide vitamins and nutrients that beans didn't have. And in the Wild West, getting those other foods was a constant challenge. Some saloons tried to make their beans special, to create a signature dish that would attract customers. They'd add secret ingredients, use special cooking methods, or serve the beans in unique ways. A saloon known for having good beans could build a reputation, could become a destination for hungry cowboys and travelers. But most saloons didn't bother. Beans were beans. They were cheap, filling, and expected. Why put in extra effort when customers would eat them anyway? The economics of saloon operation didn't reward culinary excellence. They rewarded efficiency and profit margins. The bean pot was also a source of danger. A pot of beans simmering on a stove for hours could easily burn if not watched carefully. Burned beans were inedible, and a burned pot was difficult to clean. Saloon owners and cooks had to balance the need to keep beans available with the risk of ruining a batch. And then there was the question of freshness. How long could you keep a pot of beans on the stove before they went bad? In cool weather, maybe a day or two. In hot weather, much less. But saloons didn't always throw out old beans. They'd add new beans to the pot, add more water, add more seasoning, and keep serving. The result was a pot of beans that was constantly evolving, with some beans fresh and some beans days old. This practice was risky. Old beans could harbor bacteria, could make people sick. But food safety wasn't well understood, and saloon owners were more concerned with not wasting food than with preventing illness. If someone got sick from the beans, well, that was unfortunate, but it wasn't going to stop the saloon from serving beans the next day. Beans were also a class marker. Rich men didn't eat beans if they could avoid it. They ate steak, fresh vegetables, fancy meals prepared by skilled cooks. Beans were for poor men, for working men, for men who couldn't afford better. Eating beans in a saloon marked you as someone without much money, someone who was making do with what was available. But everyone ate beans sometimes, even wealthy ranchers, even successful businessmen, even the saloon owners themselves, because beans were ubiquitous, because they were always there, because sometimes you were hungry, and beans were what was available. The class distinction was real, but it wasn't absolute. The bean empire of the Wild West was built on practicality, not preference. Nobody chose beans because they loved them. They chose beans because beans were what worked, what was available, what kept you alive. And in a harsh environment where survival was never guaranteed, that was enough. Here's something that sounds completely wrong but is absolutely true. Oysters were one of the most popular foods in Wild West saloons. Oysters. In the middle of the desert, hundreds of miles from the ocean. It sounds impossible, but it happened, and it happened a lot. The oyster craze in the American West is one of the strangest food stories in history. In the mid to late 1800s, oysters were everywhere. They were served in saloons in San Francisco, in Denver, in Dodge City, in Tombstone. They were eaten by miners, cowboys, gamblers, and businessmen. They were cheap, they were popular, and they were completely incongruous with the environment. So how did oysters end up in the middle of the desert? The answer is technology, economics, and a bit of cultural aspiration. First, the technology. The development of canning in the early 1800s revolutionized food preservation. Foods that would normally spoil quickly could be sealed in tin cans and transported long distances. Oysters were one of the first foods to be canned commercially, and by the mid-1800s, canned oysters were being shipped all over the country. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, made it even easier to transport canned goods to the West. Suddenly, foods from the East Coast could reach frontier towns in a matter of days rather than months. Canned oysters became a common sight in general stores and saloons across the West. But canned oysters weren't the only option. In some cases, live oysters were transported west in barrels of seawater. This was expensive and risky. The oysters often died during transport. But when it worked, it allowed saloons to serve fresh oysters, which commanded premium prices. The economics of oysters were interesting. Canned oysters were relatively cheap, cheaper than fresh meat in many frontier towns. This made them accessible to working-class men who couldn't afford expensive meals. At the same time, oysters had a reputation as a luxury food, associated with fancy restaurants in New York and San Francisco. Eating oysters, even canned oysters, gave men a sense of sophistication, a connection to the wider world beyond the frontier. Saloons capitalized on this. They'd advertise fresh oysters, even when they were serving canned oysters that had been sitting on a shelf for months. They'd serve oysters as part of the free lunch, knowing that the novelty would attract customers. They'd create oyster dishes, oyster stews, fried oysters, oyster cocktails, to give their menus variety and appeal. The most common way to serve oysters in a saloon was in an oyster stew. This was a simple dish: canned oysters heated in milk or cream with butter, salt, and pepper. It was served hot in a bowl, often with crackers on the side. The stew was filling, warming, and had a richness that was rare in frontier cuisine. Oyster stew became so popular that it was almost as ubiquitous as beans. Saloons would have a pot of oyster stew simmering on the stove alongside the pot of beans. You could order a bowl for a few cents, or it might be available as part of the free lunch. It was comfort food, something warm and satisfying after a long day of hard work. Fried oysters were another popular preparation. The oysters would be dredged in flour or cornmeal and fried in lard or bacon grease until crispy. They'd be served hot, sometimes with a squeeze of lemon if lemons were available, which they usually weren't. Fried oysters were more labor-intensive than oyster stew, so they were less common, but they were a treat when you could get them. Some saloons served raw oysters, but this was risky. Raw oysters spoil quickly, and in an era before refrigeration, serving raw oysters was a gamble. If the oysters were fresh, they were delicious. If they weren't, they could make you seriously ill. Most saloon owners preferred to cook their oysters, reducing the risk of food poisoning. The quality of saloon oysters varied wildly. In a coastal city like San Francisco, you might get genuinely fresh oysters, harvested that morning and served that evening. In an inland town like Denver or Dodge City, you were getting canned oysters that had been processed months earlier and transported hundreds of miles. The taste was different, the texture was different, but they were still called oysters, and people still ate them. Canned oysters had a distinctive taste that fresh oysters didn't. They were softer, mushier, with a metallic tang from the can. The liquid they were packed in was often used in cooking, adding a briny, slightly off flavor to dishes. But people got used to it. If you'd never had fresh oysters, canned oysters were just what oysters tasted like. The oyster paradox extended beyond just the strangeness of eating seafood in the desert. It was also about class and aspiration. Oysters were associated with wealth and sophistication. Eating oysters, even in a rough saloon in a frontier town, was a way of claiming a connection to that world. It was a way of saying, "I'm not just a cowboy or a miner, I'm a man of taste and culture." This aspiration was often misplaced. The oysters in frontier saloons were nothing like the oysters served in fancy restaurants in New York, but the symbolism mattered more than the reality. Men who ate oysters in saloons were participating in a cultural ritual, connecting themselves to a broader American identity that valued sophistication and refinement. The popularity of oysters also reflected the strange food culture of the Wild West. In a place where fresh food was scarce, where most meals were monotonous and bland, anything different was exciting. Oysters were different. They were exotic, unusual, a break from the endless beans and salt pork. Even if they weren't particularly good, they were interesting, and interesting was valuable. There were health risks associated with eating oysters in the Wild West. Oysters can carry bacteria and viruses that cause food poisoning. In an era before food safety regulations, before understanding of bacterial contamination, eating oysters was risky. Many people got sick from bad oysters, suffering from vomiting, diarrhea, and fever. But people kept eating them. The risk was accepted as part of life. You might get sick, but you might not. And the pleasure of eating something different, something special, was worth the risk for many people. The oyster craze eventually faded as the West became more settled, as food options increased, as refrigeration became available. Oysters lost some of their novelty. They remained popular in coastal areas, but in inland towns, they became less common. The strange period when oysters were a staple of frontier saloons passed into history, remembered now as one of the oddities of Wild West food culture. But for several decades, oysters were everywhere in the West. They were a symbol of the strange contradictions of frontier life, where you could be hundreds of miles from the ocean but still eat seafood, where you could be living in a rough mining camp but still aspire to sophistication, where technology and transportation made the impossible possible, even if the result was sometimes disappointing. Let's talk about meat, because in every Western movie, cowboys are eating steaks. Big, juicy steaks cooked over an open fire. It's one of the most persistent images of Wild West food. And like most images of the Wild West, it's mostly wrong. Meat was available in the Wild West, but it wasn't the abundant, high-quality beef that movies suggest. The reality was more complicated, more varied, and often more unpleasant. First, let's talk about beef. Yes, the West was cattle country. Millions of cattle were raised on ranches and driven to market, but those cattle weren't being slaughtered for local consumption. They were being driven to railheads and shipped east to cities like Chicago and New York, where they'd be slaughtered and sold. The beef that fed the East Coast wasn't feeding the cowboys who raised it. Cowboys on cattle drives ate very little beef. It seems paradoxical. You're surrounded by thousands of cattle, but you're not eating them. Why? Because those cattle were valuable. Each cow represented money, and killing a cow for food meant losing that money. Ranch owners didn't want their cowboys eating the product. So, what did cowboys eat? Mostly salt pork. This was pork that had been heavily salted for preservation. It was fatty, salty, and could last for months without refrigeration. The chuck wagon cook would fry up salt pork for breakfast, add it to beans for dinner, and use the rendered fat for cooking. Salt pork was cheap, portable, and reliable, which made it perfect for cattle drives. In saloons, the meat situation was similarly complicated. Some saloons did serve beef, but it wasn't always good beef. It might be tough cuts from old cattle, meat that couldn't be sold for premium prices. It might be meat that was starting to turn, that needed to be cooked and served quickly before it spoiled completely. The lack of refrigeration was a constant problem. In hot weather, meat spoiled quickly. Saloons had to either cook and serve meat immediately or preserve it through salting, smoking, or drying. Fresh meat was a luxury, available only when an animal had just been slaughtered, and only for a short time before it went bad. Some saloons had arrangements with local butchers. When a cow or pig was slaughtered, the saloon would buy some of the meat and serve it that day or the next. This was the closest thing to fresh meat that most saloons could offer, but it was unpredictable. You couldn't count on fresh meat being available. You had to take it when you could get it. Pork was more common than beef in many saloons. Pigs were easier to raise, they didn't require as much space or resources as cattle, and they could be fed on scraps and waste. A saloon owner might keep a few pigs out back, feeding them kitchen scraps and slaughtering them as needed. This provided a more reliable source of fresh meat than depending on cattle. The pork served in saloons was often fatty and greasy. Pigs raised on scraps weren't lean, healthy animals. They were fat, and that fat ended up in the meat. But fat was valuable in the Wild West. It provided calories and energy, and it made food taste better. A fatty piece of pork was considered good eating, not something to be avoided. Game meat was another option. Deer, elk, antelope, rabbit, these wild animals were hunted, and their meat was sold or traded. Some saloons served game meat when it was available. This was often better quality than the domestic meat, as wild animals were leaner and had more flavor. But game meat was unpredictable. It depended on hunters being successful, on animals being available, on the season and the weather. You couldn't build a menu around game meat because you never knew when you'd have it. It was a bonus, a special treat, not a staple. Buffalo meat was popular in the early days of the West, when buffalo were still abundant. Buffalo was lean, flavorful, and available in large quantities. Some saloons specialized in buffalo meat, serving buffalo steaks, buffalo stew, buffalo roasts. But as buffalo were hunted to near extinction in the 1870s and 80s, buffalo meat became rare and then disappeared entirely from most saloon menus. The preparation of meat in saloons was simple and often crude. Most saloons didn't have skilled cooks. They had someone who could fry meat in a pan or roast it over a fire. The meat was cooked until it was done, with little attention to temperature or technique. It was often overcooked, tough, and dry. Seasoning was minimal. Salt was the primary seasoning, sometimes pepper if it was available. Fancy spices and herbs were rare and expensive. The meat tasted like meat, salt, and whatever it had been cooked in, usually lard or bacon grease. The meat was served on tin plates or wooden boards, often with no utensils. You'd eat with your hands, tearing off pieces of meat and chewing them. If you were lucky, you might get a knife to cut the meat, but forks were uncommon. Eating was a practical, functional activity, not a refined dining experience. The quality of meat varied not just by type, but by the saloon's location and prosperity. In a wealthy town with good transportation connections, saloons might have access to better meat. In a remote mining camp or a small frontier town, the meat was whatever could be obtained locally, and the quality was often poor. There was also the question of what animal the meat came from. In a place where food was scarce and people were hungry, the line between acceptable and unacceptable meat was blurry. Horse meat was eaten, though people didn't like to admit it. Dog meat was eaten in desperate times. Even rats and other vermin might end up in the stew pot when food was scarce. Saloon owners weren't always honest about what meat they were serving. If you ordered beef and got horse, you might not know the difference, especially if it was heavily seasoned or mixed into a stew. The lack of regulation and oversight meant that saloon owners could serve whatever they wanted and call it whatever they wanted. This created a culture of suspicion around meat. Cowboys and miners would joke about mystery meat, about not asking too many questions about what you were eating. It was safer not to know. If it tasted okay and didn't make you sick, that was good enough. The meat situation in Wild West saloons was a far cry from the abundant steaks of Western movies. It was a constant struggle to obtain, preserve, and prepare meat in an environment where refrigeration didn't exist, where supply was unpredictable, and where quality was often poor. The meat you got in a saloon was whatever was available, cooked however the cook knew how to cook it, and served with the understanding that you were lucky to have meat at all. Bread was a staple of the Wild West diet, but it wasn't the soft, fluffy bread you're thinking of. The bread in frontier saloons was hard, dense, and often barely edible. But it was filling, it was cheap, and it was always available, which made it essential. There were two main types of bread in Wild West saloons: sourdough bread and biscuits. Both were made from simple ingredients: flour, water, salt, and some kind of leavening agent, but the results were very different. Sourdough bread was made using a sourdough starter, a mixture of flour and water that had been allowed to ferment, capturing wild yeast from the air. This starter was kept alive by feeding it regularly with more flour and water. Miners and cowboys would carry their sourdough starter with them, protecting it like treasure because without it, they couldn't make bread. The sourdough starter gave the bread a distinctive tangy flavor and helped it rise without commercial yeast, which was expensive and hard to obtain on the frontier. Sourdough bread was dense and chewy, with a thick crust and a sour taste that took some getting used to. In saloons, sourdough bread was often baked in large loaves and served sliced or torn into chunks. It was part of the free lunch, available to anyone who bought a drink. The bread was usually at least a day old, sometimes several days old, which made it even harder and drier. You'd dunk it in your beer or your soup to soften it enough to chew. The quality of sourdough bread depended entirely on the skill of the baker and the health of the starter. A good starter and a skilled baker could produce decent bread. A neglected starter or an unskilled baker produced bread that was dense, sour, and unpleasant. But even bad sourdough bread was better than no bread at all. Biscuits were the other main type of bread in the Wild West. These were made from flour, water or milk, salt, and baking powder or baking soda for leavening. They were quick to make, didn't require a starter, and could be cooked in a Dutch oven or on a griddle. The biscuits served in saloons were not the light, fluffy biscuits you might be imagining. They were dense, heavy, and often greasy from being cooked in lard or bacon fat. They were filling, which was the point, but they weren't particularly delicious. Biscuits were often served with gravy, a mixture of flour, fat, and milk or water cooked until thick. The gravy was usually made from the drippings of whatever meat had been cooked, giving it a meaty flavor. Biscuits and gravy was a common meal in saloons, cheap, filling, and requiring minimal ingredients. The gravy was often more fat than anything else. The cook would pour off the fat from cooking meat, add some flour to thicken it, and add liquid to make it pourable. The result was a greasy, salty sauce that soaked into the biscuits and made them more palatable. It wasn't haute cuisine, but it was calories, and calories were what mattered. Cornbread was another option, especially in the South and Southwest. Cornbread was made from cornmeal, which was cheaper than wheat flour in many areas. It was dense, crumbly, and slightly sweet. Cornbread was often served with beans or chili, the sweetness of the corn complementing the savory, spicy flavors. The cornbread in saloons was usually cooked in a cast iron skillet, creating a crispy crust on the bottom and sides. It was served hot, cut into wedges, and eaten with your hands. Like sourdough and biscuits, cornbread was filling and cheap, which made it perfect for feeding hungry men on a budget. All of these breads shared some common characteristics. They were dense and heavy, designed to fill you up with minimal ingredients. They were often dry, requiring something to drink or some kind of sauce or gravy to make them easier to eat. And they were made with whatever ingredients were available, which meant the quality varied wildly. Flour was expensive on the frontier, especially in remote areas where it had to be transported long distances. Saloon owners used flour sparingly, stretching it as far as possible. This meant the bread was often made with less flour and more water than ideal, resulting in a denser, heavier product. The flour itself was often of poor quality. It might be old, infested with weevils, or contaminated with other substances. Bakers would sift the flour to remove the worst of the impurities, but they couldn't remove everything. You'd sometimes find bits of insect or other foreign matter in your bread, but you ate it anyway because wasting food wasn't an option. Baking bread in a saloon was a challenge. Most saloons didn't have proper ovens. They had wood-burning stoves or fireplaces, and baking in these was more art than science. The temperature was hard to control, the heat was uneven, and burning was a constant risk. Bakers had to learn through experience how to manage the fire, how long to bake, how to tell when the bread was done. The result was bread that was often unevenly cooked. The outside might be burned while the inside was still doughy, or the bread might be cooked through but dry and hard. Perfectly baked bread was rare, a sign of a skilled baker and a well-managed fire. Bread was also used as a utensil. In a time when plates and utensils were scarce, bread served as an edible plate. You'd put your beans or stew on a thick slice of bread, eat the food, and then eat the bread, which had soaked up all the juices and flavors. This was practical and efficient, reducing the need for dishes that would have to be washed. The bread in Wild West saloons was also a social equalizer. Rich and poor, everyone ate the same bread. It was one of the few foods that was truly democratic, available to anyone who walked into a saloon. The quality might vary, but the basic product was the same for everyone. But bread alone wasn't enough to sustain you. It provided carbohydrates and some calories, but it lacked protein, vitamins, and other nutrients. You needed to eat bread with other foods, beans, meat, vegetables to get a complete diet. Bread was the foundation, but it couldn't be the whole meal. The monotony of bread was another issue. Eating the same type of bread day after day, week after week, was boring. People craved variety, but variety was hard to come by. The bread was always there, always the same, always filling but never exciting. Some saloons tried to make their bread special. They'd add ingredients like dried fruit, nuts, or honey to create a sweeter, more interesting bread. But these additions were expensive, and most saloon owners couldn't justify the cost. The bread remained simple, basic, and utilitarian. The bread and biscuit reality of Wild West saloons was one of making do with limited resources. The bread wasn't good by modern standards, but it was good enough for the time and place. It filled stomachs, provided energy, and kept people alive. And in the harsh environment of the frontier, that was all that mattered. Here's something that might surprise you. Vegetables were almost non-existent in Wild West saloons. In movies, you see tables laden with fresh produce, colorful salads, crisp vegetables. In reality, if you wanted vegetables in a frontier saloon, you were out of luck. The lack of vegetables in the Wild West diet was a serious problem. Vegetables provide essential vitamins and nutrients that prevent diseases like scurvy. Without them, people got sick. But getting fresh vegetables to frontier towns was nearly impossible, and growing them locally was difficult. Let's start with why vegetables were so scarce. First, transportation. Vegetables are perishable. They spoil quickly, especially in hot weather. Transporting them from farms to frontier towns took days or weeks, and by the time they arrived, they were often rotten. The lack of refrigeration made this problem worse. There was no way to keep vegetables fresh during transport. Second, local growing conditions. Many parts of the West were arid, with limited water for irrigation. Growing vegetables required water, good soil, and knowledge of farming techniques. Many frontier towns were in places where these conditions didn't exist. The soil was poor, water was scarce, and the people settling these areas were miners, cowboys, and merchants, not farmers. Third, economics. Vegetables were bulky and heavy relative to their value. It made more economic sense to transport flour, beans, and canned goods, which were lighter, lasted longer, and provided more calories per pound. Vegetables were a luxury that most frontier towns couldn't afford. The few vegetables that did make it to frontier saloons were usually preserved in some way. Pickled vegetables were common: cucumbers, onions, cabbage, preserved in vinegar and salt. These lasted much longer than fresh vegetables and could be transported without spoiling. Pickled vegetables were part of the free lunch in many saloons. They were salty and sour, which made them good accompaniments to the greasy, heavy foods that dominated saloon menus. But they weren't fresh vegetables. They didn't provide the same nutritional benefits, and they didn't taste the same. Canned vegetables became available in the late 1800s as canning technology improved. Canned tomatoes, corn, and peas could be shipped west and stored for months. Some saloons served canned vegetables, usually heated and served as a side dish or mixed into stews. But canned vegetables were expensive and the quality was poor. The canning process destroyed much of the nutritional value and changed the texture and flavor. Canned vegetables were mushy, bland, and nothing like fresh vegetables. But they were better than nothing. And in a place where fresh vegetables were unavailable, canned vegetables were a luxury. Dried vegetables were another option. Onions, peppers, and other vegetables could be dried and reconstituted later. Dried vegetables lasted a long time and were lightweight, making them practical for transport. But the drying process changed the flavor and texture, and not everyone liked the result. Potatoes were one of the few vegetables that were relatively common in the Wild West. Potatoes could be stored for months in cool, dark conditions without spoiling. They were nutritious, filling, and versatile. Saloons served potatoes boiled, fried, or mashed, often as a side dish with meat. But even potatoes weren't always available. In remote areas or during winter months, potatoes were scarce. And when they were available, they were often old, sprouted, or partially rotten. You'd cut away the bad parts and eat the rest, because wasting food wasn't an option. Onions were another relatively common vegetable. Like potatoes, onions could be stored for extended periods. They were used to flavor stews, beans, and meat dishes. Raw onions were sometimes available as part of the free lunch, though they were often old and strong-tasting. Beyond potatoes and onions, fresh vegetables were rare. Carrots, cabbage, lettuce, tomatoes, these were luxuries that most people in the West rarely saw. If you wanted fresh vegetables, you had to grow them yourself, and most people didn't have the time, space, or knowledge to do so. The lack of vegetables in the diet had serious health consequences. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was common among miners and cowboys who went months without fresh produce. The symptoms included fatigue, bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death if untreated. Some people tried to prevent scurvy by eating wild plants. Certain plants that grew in the West contained vitamin C and could prevent or treat scurvy, but you had to know which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous. Many people didn't have this knowledge, and eating the wrong plant could make you sick or kill you. The lack of vegetables also meant that meals were monotonous and unbalanced. A typical meal in a Wild West saloon might be beans, salt pork, and bread. All carbohydrates, protein, and fat, but no vegetables, no vitamins, no fiber beyond what the beans provided. This diet kept you alive, but it didn't keep you healthy. Some saloons in more prosperous towns made efforts to serve vegetables. In San Francisco, for example, saloons could get fresh produce from nearby farms. These saloons might serve salads, fresh tomatoes, or other vegetables as part of their menu. But this was the exception, not the rule. In most frontier towns, vegetables were a distant memory, something people remembered from back east but couldn't get in the West. Cowboys and miners would talk about fresh vegetables the way people talk about luxury items, with longing and nostalgia. The vegetable desert of the Wild West was a significant hardship. It made the diet less healthy, less varied, and less enjoyable. It contributed to health problems and made life on the frontier even more difficult. But it was an unavoidable consequence of the environment and the limitations of the time. Some people adapted by learning to appreciate the foods that were available. They learned to love beans, to enjoy salt pork, to find satisfaction in a simple meal of bread and gravy. They stopped thinking about what they couldn't have and focused on what they could. Others never adapted. They remained bitter about the lack of vegetables, about the monotony of the diet, about the constant feeling of being nutritionally deprived. They counted the days until they could leave the frontier and return to a place where fresh vegetables were available. The vegetable situation improved slowly as the West became more settled. Farms were established, irrigation systems were built, and transportation improved. By the early 1900s, fresh vegetables were more common in Western towns. But during the height of the frontier era, from the 1850s through the 1880s, vegetables were a rare luxury that most people in Wild West saloons never experienced. We can't talk about Wild West saloons without talking about drinking, because saloons were, first and foremost, drinking establishments. The food was secondary, almost an afterthought. The real business was alcohol, and the drinking culture of the Wild West was intense, dangerous, and central to social life. Let's start with what people were actually drinking. The most common alcoholic beverage in Wild West saloons was whiskey, but this wasn't the smooth, aged whiskey you might drink today. This was rough, harsh liquor that burned going down and left you with a splitting headache the next morning. The whiskey served in most saloons was cheap rot gut, made from whatever grain was available and distilled quickly with little attention to quality. It was often diluted with water to stretch it further, and sometimes it was adulterated with other substances to give it more kick or to disguise poor quality. Some saloons added things like tobacco, turpentine, or even strychnine to their whiskey. These additives gave the whiskey a stronger taste and a more powerful effect, but they were also poisonous. Drinking adulterated whiskey could make you sick, and in some cases, it could kill you. The whiskey was served in shot glasses, small glasses that held about an ounce of liquid. You'd order a shot, the bartender would pour it, and you'd drink it down in one gulp. This wasn't sipping whiskey. This was drinking to get drunk, quickly and efficiently. The price of whiskey varied depending on the saloon and the location. In a prosperous town with competition between saloons, a shot might cost 5 or 10 cents. In a remote mining camp with only one saloon, it might cost 25 cents or more. Either way, it was cheap enough that working men could afford to drink regularly. Beer was also popular, though it was less common than whiskey in many frontier towns. Beer was harder to transport and store than whiskey. It was bulky, it spoiled quickly, and it required special equipment to serve. But in towns with breweries or good transportation connections, beer was available. The beer served in Wild West saloons was not like modern beer. It was warm, flat, and often sour. There was no refrigeration, so the beer was served at room temperature, which in a hot saloon could be quite warm. The beer was stored in barrels, and once a barrel was tapped, it had to be consumed quickly before it went bad. The beer was poured into mugs or glasses, often without much attention to cleanliness. The same glass might be used for multiple customers, rinsed quickly between uses if at all. Hygiene wasn't a priority. Getting the beer served and the customer drinking was the priority. Wine was less common in Wild West saloons, though it was available in some places. California had a growing wine industry in the late 1800s, and California wines were shipped to saloons throughout the West. But wine was more expensive than whiskey or beer, and it was seen as a more refined drink, not something for rough cowboys and miners. The drinking culture in saloons was aggressive and social. Men drank together, buying rounds for each other, competing to see who could drink the most. Refusing a drink was seen as insulting, as rejecting the social bond that drinking together created. You were expected to drink when offered, to reciprocate by buying drinks for others, to participate in the communal drinking culture. This culture led to excessive drinking. Men would drink far more than they intended, caught up in the social pressure and the competitive atmosphere. They'd start with one drink and end up having 10, spending money they couldn't afford and getting drunk when they'd planned to stay sober. The effects of this drinking were visible in every saloon. Men stumbling, slurring their words, getting into arguments and fights. The combination of alcohol, testosterone, and weapons was dangerous. Many saloon fights ended with someone getting shot or stabbed. Saloon owners encouraged drinking. They made their money from alcohol sales, so the more their customers drank, the more profit they made. The free lunch was designed to make people thirsty. The social atmosphere encouraged drinking. The bartenders would push drinks, suggesting another round, offering special deals, doing whatever they could to keep the alcohol flowing. Some men became alcoholics, unable to control their drinking, spending all their money on alcohol and neglecting their work and families. Alcoholism was common in the Wild West, a consequence of the drinking culture, the harsh living conditions, and the lack of other entertainment or social outlets. Women rarely drank in saloons. Saloons were male spaces, and women who entered them were assumed to be prostitutes or otherwise disreputable. Respectable women didn't drink in public, and they certainly didn't drink in saloons. This gender segregation reinforced the aggressive, masculine drinking culture. The drinking also had economic consequences. Men would spend their wages on alcohol, leaving them with little money for food, clothing, or other necessities. Families suffered when the breadwinner drank away his paycheck. Some towns tried to address this by having dry days or restricting saloon hours, but these efforts were often ineffective. The quality of the alcohol varied wildly. In a reputable saloon in a prosperous town, you might get decent whiskey or beer. In a rough saloon in a mining camp, you might get poison disguised as alcohol. There was no regulation, no quality control, no way to know what you were drinking until you drank it. Some saloons developed reputations for having good alcohol. These saloons could charge higher prices and attract a better class of customer. Other saloons were known for serving rotgut, and they attracted desperate men who couldn't afford better or didn't care about quality. The bartender was a key figure in the drinking culture. A good bartender knew his customers, knew how much they could drink, knew when to cut them off and when to keep serving. A bad bartender would serve anyone anything, not caring about the consequences as long as the money kept coming. Bartenders also served as informal counselors and mediators. Men would talk to the bartender about their problems, their hopes, their fears. The bartender would listen, offer advice, and sometimes intervene in disputes before they turned violent. A skilled bartender could manage the social dynamics of a saloon, keeping things friendly and profitable, but bartenders were also enablers. They served alcohol to men who were already drunk, who were clearly unable to handle more. They encouraged drinking because that's how they made money. The bartender's role was complicated, part caretaker, part exploiter. The drinking culture of Wild West saloons was central to social life on the frontier. It provided entertainment, social connection, and an escape from the harsh realities of frontier life. But it also caused enormous harm, contributing to violence, poverty, and health problems. The saloon was both a refuge and a trap, offering comfort while extracting a heavy price. The Wild West wasn't just white cowboys and saloons serving beans. It was a diverse place, with people from all over the world bringing their food traditions with them. And these ethnic influences shaped what people ate in saloons, creating a more varied and interesting food culture than most people realize. Let's start with Mexican food. The American Southwest was part of Mexico until 1848, and Mexican people and Mexican food culture were deeply embedded in the region. Many saloons in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California served Mexican-influenced dishes. Chili con carne, which we now think of as Texan, has Mexican roots. It's a stew of meat, chili peppers, and spices, and it was served in saloons throughout the Southwest. The chili was hot, spicy, and filling, perfect for cold nights or for making you thirsty enough to order another drink. Tamales were another Mexican food that appeared in saloons. These are corn dough filled with meat or beans, wrapped in corn husks, and steamed. They were portable, filling, and could be made in large batches. Some saloons would have tamale vendors outside, selling tamales to customers as they entered or left. Tortillas were used instead of bread in some southwestern saloons. They were made from corn or wheat flour, cooked on a griddle, and served warm. You'd use tortillas to scoop up beans or meat, or you'd wrap them around fillings to make simple tacos or burritos. The Mexican influence also brought new flavors and ingredients: chili peppers, cumin, cilantro, lime. These were incorporated into saloon cooking, adding spice and complexity to dishes that might otherwise be bland. The fusion of Mexican and American food traditions created something new, a southwestern cuisine that was distinct from both. Chinese food was another major influence, especially in California and other areas with large Chinese populations. Chinese immigrants came to the West during the gold rush and to build the railroads, and they brought their food traditions with them. Chinese restaurants and saloons served dishes like chop suey, chow mein, and fried rice. These weren't authentic Chinese dishes. They were Americanized versions created to appeal to Western palates, but they were popular and widely available. Some saloons were run by Chinese immigrants, and they served a mix of American and Chinese food. You might get beans and salt pork alongside fried rice and vegetables. This fusion was practical, serving what customers wanted while also offering something different and exotic. Chinese cooks were valued for their skills and their willingness to work for lower wages than white cooks. Many saloons, restaurants, and mining camps employed Chinese cooks, who adapted their cooking to available ingredients and customer preferences. The Chinese influence also brought new cooking techniques. Stir-frying, steaming, and other methods that were unfamiliar to American cooks were introduced and gradually adopted. These techniques allowed for faster cooking and better preservation of nutrients, improving the quality of food. German immigrants brought their food traditions as well. German saloons and beer gardens were common in cities like San Francisco and Denver. These establishments served German beer, sausages, sauerkraut, and pretzels. The German influence on saloon food was significant. Sausages became a staple of the free lunch counter. Sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, was served as a side dish or condiment. Pretzels, salty and twisted, were perfect for making customers thirsty. German brewing techniques improved the quality of beer in the West. German brewers established breweries that produced better beer than the rough, sour beer that had been common earlier. This made beer more popular and more widely available. Irish immigrants also influenced saloon culture. Irish pubs and saloons served Irish whiskey, stews, and simple, hearty food. The Irish tradition of the pub as a social gathering place shaped how American saloons functioned as places for community, conversation, and drinking. Italian immigrants brought pasta, tomato sauce, and other Italian foods. While Italian restaurants were more common than Italian saloons, Italian food influences appeared in saloon menus. Spaghetti, meatballs, and tomato-based sauces were incorporated into the mix of available foods. The ethnic diversity of the Wild West created a food culture that was more varied than the stereotype of beans and beef suggests. In a large city like San Francisco, you could find saloons serving Mexican, Chinese, German, Irish, and Italian food, all within a few blocks of each other. But this diversity wasn't evenly distributed. In small frontier towns, especially those with predominantly white populations, ethnic food influences were minimal. The food remained simple, basic, and monotonous. The diversity was concentrated in larger towns and cities with more diverse populations. There was also tension around ethnic food. Some white Americans were suspicious of foreign foods, seeing them as strange, unclean, or inferior. Chinese food, in particular, was subject to racist stereotypes and discrimination. Chinese restaurants and saloons were sometimes targeted by violence or boycotts. But economic necessity often overcame prejudice. If the Chinese restaurant was the only place to get a hot meal, people ate there. If the Mexican saloon had the best chili in town, people went there. Hunger and practicality could bridge cultural divides, at least temporarily. The ethnic food influences also created fusion dishes that were unique to the American West. Chili con carne, chop suey, the mission-style burrito. These were all created in the West, blending different food traditions into something new. These fusion dishes reflected the reality of the West as a place where different cultures collided, competed, and sometimes cooperated. The food was a microcosm of the larger social dynamics, showing both the possibilities and the tensions of a diverse society. The ethnic food influences in Wild West saloons added flavor, variety, and interest to a food culture that could otherwise be monotonous and bland. They showed that the West wasn't just a white Anglo-Saxon place, but a diverse, multicultural frontier where people from all over the world were trying to make a living and create a new life. Now let's talk about something that's going to make you never want to eat in a Wild West saloon: the hygiene, or rather, the complete lack of hygiene. Because the sanitary conditions in frontier saloons were absolutely horrifying by modern standards. Let's start with the most basic issue: hand washing. Nobody washed their hands. Not the cooks, not the bartenders, not the customers. The concept of washing your hands before eating or after using the toilet wasn't widely understood or practiced. People would handle food with dirty hands, hands that had been touching horses, handling money, doing manual labor, and nobody thought twice about it. There was no running water in most saloons. Water had to be hauled from a well or a stream, and it was used sparingly. Washing hands required water, soap, and time, all of which were in short supply, so people just didn't do it. The lack of hand washing meant that diseases spread easily. Bacteria and viruses were transferred from person to person through food, through shared utensils, through touching the same surfaces. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other diseases were common in frontier towns, and saloons were major vectors of transmission. The dishes and utensils in saloons were rarely cleaned properly. After a customer finished eating, the bartender or server would wipe the plate with a rag and use it for the next customer. The rag itself was filthy, having been used to wipe multiple plates, clean the bar, and mop up spills. It was spreading germs more than removing them. Glasses and mugs were treated the same way: a quick rinse in a bucket of water, if that, and then reused for the next customer. The water in the bucket was changed infrequently, so by the end of the day you were essentially washing your glass in dirty water that dozens of other people had used. Utensils, when they were available, were communal. Everyone used the same knife to cut cheese, the same spoon to serve beans, the same fork to spear pickles. These utensils were rarely washed. They were wiped on a rag or on someone's pants, and then put back for the next person to use. The free lunch counter was a particular hygiene nightmare. Food sat out for hours, exposed to flies, dust, and the coughs and sneezes of customers. People would touch the food with their bare hands, taking what they wanted and leaving the rest for others. Flies would land on the food, laying eggs and spreading disease. In hot weather, food on the free lunch counter would spoil quickly. Meat would turn, dairy products would curdle, and everything would develop a smell. But saloon owners were reluctant to throw out food, so they'd leave it out, hoping someone would eat it before it became obviously inedible. The floors of saloons were covered in sawdust, which was supposed to absorb spills and make cleaning easier. But the sawdust also absorbed tobacco spit, spilled alcohol, food scraps, and worse. It became a disgusting, bacteria-laden mess that was rarely changed. Walking across a saloon floor meant walking through a layer of filth. Spittoons were provided for tobacco chewers to spit into, but many men missed or didn't bother using them. Tobacco spit ended up on the floor, on the bar, sometimes on other customers. The smell of tobacco spit mixed with alcohol and unwashed bodies created an olfactory assault that was overwhelming. The toilets, when they existed, were outhouses located behind the saloon. These were crude structures, basically a hole in the ground with a wooden seat over it. They smelled terrible. They were infested with flies, and they were rarely cleaned. Using the outhouse was an unpleasant necessity that everyone tried to avoid as much as possible. Many men didn't bother with the outhouse. They'd urinate outside, behind the building, or in an alley. This created puddles of urine that attracted flies and created a terrible smell. In hot weather, The smell of urine mixed with the other smells of the saloon created an almost unbearable stench. The lack of sewage systems meant that waste accumulated. Outhouses would fill up and overflow. Waste would seep into the ground, contaminating wells and water sources. This led to outbreaks of waterborne diseases that killed many people. The kitchen, if the saloon had one, was no better. There were no health inspections, no regulations, no standards. The kitchen was whatever space the saloon owner designated for food preparation, and it was often dirty, poorly ventilated, and infested with vermin. Rats and mice were constant problems. They'd get into food stores, contaminate ingredients, and leave droppings everywhere. Saloon owners would set traps and try to keep the rodent population under control, but it was a losing battle. Where there was food, there were rodents. Flies were another major problem. In warm weather, flies were everywhere, landing on food, on people, on every surface. They spread disease, contaminated food, and were a constant annoyance. There were no screens on windows, no way to keep flies out. You just accepted that flies were part of life. The cooks themselves were often dirty. They'd work all day in a hot kitchen, sweating, and they had no way to clean themselves. Their clothes were stained with food, grease, and sweat. They'd wipe their hands on their aprons, which were never washed, and then handle food. Food storage was primitive. There was no refrigeration, so perishable foods had to be used quickly or preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. Food that was starting to spoil would be cooked and served, with the hope that cooking would kill any bacteria. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. The lack of understanding about bacteria and disease meant that people didn't connect poor hygiene with illness. They knew that people got sick, but they didn't understand why. They attributed illness to bad air, moral failings, or bad luck, not to the filthy conditions they lived in. Some people did try to maintain better hygiene. They'd wash their hands when they could, avoid obviously spoiled food, and be careful about what they ate and drank. But these efforts were limited by the available resources and the prevailing culture. The hygiene nightmare of Wild West saloons was a major factor in the high mortality rates of the frontier. People died from diseases that were preventable with basic sanitation. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, these diseases killed thousands of people, and saloons were major sites of transmission. Eating in a Wild West saloon meant accepting a level of filth and contamination that would be unthinkable today. Every meal was a gamble. You might be fine or you might get sick. You might have a mild stomach upset or you might die. The food wasn't just unappetizing, it was dangerous. Let's talk about money, because understanding what people ate in Wild West saloons requires understanding the economics of food on the frontier. Food was expensive, wages were low, and the economics shaped every aspect of saloon dining. First, let's establish what things cost. In the 1870s and 80s, a working cowboy might earn $30 to $40 a month. A miner might earn a bit more, maybe $50 to $75 a month, depending on the mine and the location. These were the wages for hard, dangerous work, and they weren't much. Now let's look at food prices. A meal in a saloon, if you were buying a full meal rather than just eating from the free lunch, might cost 25 to 50 cents. That doesn't sound like much, but remember, you're earning $30 a month. If you're eating 3 meals a day at 50 cents each, that's $45 a month just for food, more than your entire wages. This is why the free lunch was so important. It allowed working men to eat without spending money they didn't have. You'd buy a 5-cent beer and eat as much as you could from the free lunch counter. That was a meal for a nickel, affordable even on a cowboy's wages. But the free lunch wasn't always available, and it wasn't always enough. If you were doing hard physical labor, you needed more calories than the free lunch provided. You'd have to buy additional food, which meant spending money you couldn't afford. The cost of individual food items varied depending on location and availability. In a town with good transportation connections, flour might cost $3 to $5 for a 50-pound sack. In a remote mining camp, that same sack might cost $10 or $15. The farther you were from supply sources, the more expensive everything became. Meat was expensive. A pound of beef might cost 10 to 20 cents, a significant expense when you're earning $1 a day. Pork was slightly cheaper, but still expensive. Game meat, if you could get it, was cheaper because you could hunt it yourself, but not everyone had the time or skills to hunt. Beans were cheap. which is why they were so ubiquitous. A pound of dried beans might cost 5 to 10 cents, and a pound of beans could feed several people. This made beans the most economical source of protein and calories. Bread was relatively cheap if you bought it from a bakery, maybe 5 cents for a loaf, but many people made their own bread to save money. Flour was cheaper than bread, so if you had the time and skills to bake, you could save money. Alcohol was priced to maximize profit. A shot of whiskey cost 5 to 10 cents, and a beer cost about the same. These prices were low enough to be affordable, but high enough to generate significant profit for the saloon owner. And because people drank multiple drinks, the profits added up quickly. The economics of saloon operation were based on alcohol sales. Food was a loss leader, something offered to attract customers and keep them drinking. The free lunch might cost the saloon owner a few dollars a day, but if it brought in customers who spent money on drinks, it was worth it. Saloon owners had to balance the cost of providing food with the need to attract customers. Offering too little food meant customers would go elsewhere. Offering too much meant losing money. The goal was to provide just enough food to keep customers happy and drinking without cutting into profits. The quality of food was also an economic decision. Better quality food cost more, which meant lower profits. Saloon owners had to decide whether the increased customer satisfaction from better food was worth the decreased profit margin. In most cases, they decided it wasn't. This is why saloon food was often poor quality. It wasn't that saloon owners didn't know how to provide better food. It was that better food didn't make economic sense. Customers would eat whatever was provided as long as it was cheap or free, so there was no incentive to improve quality. The economics also affected what foods were available. Foods that were cheap, portable, and long-lasting were favored. Foods that were expensive, perishable, or required skilled preparation were avoided. This is why saloon menus were so limited and repetitive. For customers, the economics of eating in saloons were challenging. If you were a working man with limited income, you had to make difficult choices. Do you spend money on food or save it for other necessities? Do you eat well today and go hungry tomorrow, or do you eat poorly but consistently? Many men chose to eat as cheaply as possible, surviving on the free lunch and supplementing with cheap foods like bread and beans. This allowed them to save money for other things, like clothing, lodging, or sending money home to family. But this strategy had costs. Eating poorly affected your health, your energy, and your ability to work. Men who were malnourished couldn't work as hard or as long, which affected their earnings. It was a vicious cycle. Low wages led to poor nutrition, which led to reduced work capacity, which led to lower wages. Some men spent too much money on alcohol and not enough on food. They'd drink away their wages, leaving themselves with no money for meals. These men would rely entirely on the free lunch, eating whatever they could get without spending money. This was a survival strategy, but it was a desperate one. The economics of food in the Wild West also created opportunities for entrepreneurs. People who could provide food cheaply and efficiently could make money. Chinese restaurants, Mexican food vendors, bakeries, these businesses filled a need and provided employment. But the economics also created exploitation. Workers were paid low wages, food was expensive, and saloon owners and other businesses profited from the difference. The system was designed to extract as much money as possible from working men, while providing them with the minimum necessary to survive. The cost and economics of food in Wild West saloons reflected the broader economic realities of the frontier. It was a harsh, unforgiving environment where money was scarce, prices were high, and survival was a constant struggle. The food people ate was shaped by these economic realities, and understanding the economics helps us understand why the food was the way it was. Not every day in a Wild West saloon was the same. There were special occasions, holidays, celebrations, times when the usual monotonous food was replaced with something better. These occasions were rare, but they were important, providing breaks from the routine and creating memories that men would talk about for years. Christmas was the biggest food holiday in the Wild West. Saloons would make special efforts to provide better food on Christmas Day. There might be roast turkey or goose, if available. There might be pies, cakes, or other desserts. The free lunch would be expanded and improved, with better quality meats, fresh bread, and maybe even some vegetables. The Christmas meal was a communal event. Men who had nowhere else to go who were far from family, would gather in the saloon to eat and drink together. The saloon became a substitute family, a place where lonely men could find companionship and celebration. Saloon owners understood the importance of Christmas. Providing a good Christmas meal built loyalty and goodwill. Men would remember which saloons treated them well on Christmas and would return throughout the year. It was good business as well as good community relations. Thanksgiving was another important food holiday, though it was less universally celebrated than Christmas. Some saloons would provide a special Thanksgiving meal, with turkey, stuffing, and other traditional foods. But Thanksgiving was more of a family holiday, and many men would leave town to be with family if they could. 4th of July was celebrated with food and drink, though the focus was more on drinking and fireworks than on elaborate meals. Saloons might provide extra food for the free lunch, and there might be barbecues or outdoor cooking. The 4th was a day of patriotic celebration, and food was part of that celebration. Local celebrations and events also prompted special food offerings. If a town was celebrating the arrival of the railroad, the opening of a new mine, or some other significant event, saloons would provide better food to mark the occasion. These celebrations were opportunities for saloons to show off, to demonstrate their importance to the community. Personal celebrations were also marked with food. If a cowboy got paid after a long cattle drive, he might buy a real meal, not just the free lunch. If a miner struck it rich, he might treat everyone in the saloon to drinks and food. These personal celebrations were ways of sharing good fortune and building social bonds. Weddings, when they occurred, were often celebrated in saloons. The saloon would provide food and drink for the wedding party and guests. The food might be better than usual, with special dishes prepared for the occasion. The saloon became a community center, hosting important life events. Funerals were also sometimes held in saloons, especially in small towns without churches or other gathering spaces. After a funeral, mourners would gather in the saloon to eat, drink, and remember the deceased. The saloon provided food and drink, and the community came together to grieve and support each other. The food at these special occasions was better than the everyday fare, but it wasn't fancy by modern standards. It was still frontier food, prepared with limited ingredients and equipment, but it was made with more care, more attention, and more generosity than the usual saloon offerings. Special occasion foods might include roasted meats, which were expensive and time-consuming to prepare. A whole turkey, a roast of beef, a pig roasted over an open fire. These were centerpieces of celebration meals. The meat would be carved and served to everyone, a communal feast that brought people together. Pies and cakes were special occasion desserts. These required sugar, eggs, and other expensive ingredients, as well as skill to prepare. A good pie or cake was a luxury, something that most people rarely got to eat. When a saloon provided dessert, it was a sign that this was a special day. Fresh bread, rather than day-old bread, might be served on special occasions. The bread would be warm, soft, and delicious, a stark contrast to the usual hard, stale bread. This simple improvement made a big difference in the quality of the meal. Vegetables, when available, might appear on special occasions. Fresh vegetables were so rare that their presence marked a meal as truly special. A salad, fresh tomatoes, or cooked vegetables were treats that people savored. The drinks were also better on special occasions. Instead of rot-gut whiskey, a saloon might serve better quality liquor. Instead of warm, flat beer, there might be fresher beer, or even champagne for the most special occasions. The atmosphere in the saloon was different on special occasions. There was more laughter, more singing, more camaraderie. The usual tensions and conflicts were set aside, at least temporarily. Men who might normally be rivals or strangers would eat and drink together, united by the celebration. These special occasions were important for mental health and morale. Life on the frontier was hard, monotonous, and often lonely. Special occasions provided breaks from the routine, moments of joy and connection that made the hardships more bearable. They also reinforced community bonds. When people celebrated together, when they shared food and drink, they created shared memories and strengthened social ties. The saloon wasn't just a place to drink. It was a community center, and special occasions highlighted this role. But special occasions were rare. Most days were ordinary, with ordinary food and ordinary routines. The special occasions stood out precisely because they were different, because they offered a glimpse of something better than the usual frontier existence. Men would look forward to these occasions, counting down the days until Christmas or the 4th of July. They'd save money to be able to participate fully, to buy drinks for others, to contribute to the celebration. The anticipation was almost as important as the event itself. And after the special occasion was over, after the food was eaten and the drinks were drunk, men would return to their usual routines. But they'd have memories of the celebration, stories to tell, and the knowledge that another special occasion would come eventually. These memories and this hope helped them endure the hardships of frontier life. So now that we've explored what people really ate in Wild West saloons, let's talk about why you, a modern person with modern sensibilities and modern expectations, would absolutely hate eating there. First, the hygiene. You're used to clean restaurants with health inspections, sanitized dishes, and food handlers who wash their hands. In a Wild West saloon, none of that existed. You'd be eating food that had been touched by dozens of dirty hands, served on plates that hadn't been properly washed, using utensils that everyone else had used. The thought alone would probably make you sick, and the reality would definitely make you sick. The food itself would be almost inedible by your standards. You're used to fresh, flavorful food with variety and seasoning. Saloon food was stale, bland, and monotonous. The bread was hard, the meat was salty and tough, the beans were mushy and greasy. Nothing tasted good. It was all just fuel, calories to keep you alive, with no attention to flavor or enjoyment. The lack of vegetables would be shocking. You're used to having vegetables with every meal, to salads and fresh produce. In a saloon, you'd be lucky to get a pickle. The absence of fresh, healthy food would make you feel sluggish and unwell within days. The portions and presentation would disappoint you. You're used to food being presented attractively, with appropriate portions and garnishes. Saloon food was slapped on a tin plate or served in a bowl, with no attention to appearance. The portions were either too small, leaving you hungry, or too large, overwhelming you with food you didn't want to eat. The smell would be overwhelming. You're used to restaurants that smell like food cooking. Saloons smelled like unwashed bodies, tobacco spit, spilled alcohol, and the accumulated filth of the sawdust-covered floor. The smell of food, when you could detect it, was often unappetizing. The smell of grease and salt and things that had been sitting out too long. The noise and chaos would make eating unpleasant. You're used to relatively quiet restaurants where you can have a conversation. Saloons were loud, crowded, chaotic places. Men were shouting, arguing, laughing. Glasses were clinking, chairs were scraping, and there was a constant background noise that made it hard to think or relax. The lack of privacy would bother you. You're used to having your own table, your own space. In a saloon, you'd be eating at a crowded bar or table, pressed up against strangers with no personal space. People would be reaching across you, bumping into you, and generally invading your space in ways that would make you uncomfortable. The drinking culture would be oppressive. You're used to being able to eat without drinking, or to have one drink with your meal. In a saloon, you'd be pressured to drink, to buy rounds, to participate in the communal drinking. Refusing would mark you as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong. The violence would terrify you. You're used to safe restaurants where the worst thing that might happen is slow service. In saloons, fights were common. Men would argue, push, and sometimes pull guns or knives. Eating in a saloon meant accepting the risk that violence could erupt at any moment and you might be caught in the middle. The cost, relative to quality, would seem outrageous. You're used to getting good value for your money, to paying for quality food. In a saloon, you'd be paying for terrible food or eating free food that was designed to make you buy overpriced drinks. The economics would feel exploitative, and you'd resent being manipulated. The lack of options would frustrate you. You're used to menus with dozens of choices, to being able to customize your order. In a saloon, you got what was available, which was usually beans, bread, and maybe some meat. No substitutions, no special requests, no accommodations for dietary preferences or restrictions. The unpredictability would make you anxious. You're used to knowing what you're going to get when you order food. In a saloon, the quality and availability of food varied wildly from day to day. You never knew if the meat would be fresh or spoiled, if the bread would be edible or rock hard, if there would be any food at all. The social dynamics would be uncomfortable. You're used to restaurants where everyone is treated equally, where service is professional and courteous. In saloons, there was a clear hierarchy. Rich men got better treatment than poor men. Regulars were favored over strangers. If you didn't fit in, if you weren't part of the social group, you'd be made to feel unwelcome. The lack of dietary accommodations would be a problem. You're used to restaurants that can accommodate vegetarians, vegans, people with allergies or religious dietary restrictions. In a saloon, there were no accommodations. You ate what was served or you didn't eat. If you couldn't eat pork for religious reasons, too bad. If you were allergic to something, you'd just have to avoid it and hope for the best. The physical discomfort would wear you down. You're used to comfortable seating, climate control, and clean restrooms. Saloons had hard wooden chairs or benches, no heating or cooling, and outhouses that were disgusting. The physical environment would make eating unpleasant, even if the food were good, which it wasn't. The time pressure would stress you. You're used to leisurely meals where you can take your time. In a saloon, especially during busy times, you were expected to eat quickly and make room for the next customer. Lingering over your meal wasn't appreciated. You ate, you drank, you left. The lack of cleanliness in food preparation would horrify you. You're used to food being prepared in clean kitchens by people wearing gloves and hairnets. In saloons, food was prepared in dirty kitchens by people who didn't wash their hands, didn't cover their hair, and didn't follow any food safety practices. If you saw how your food was prepared, you'd never eat it. The reality is that eating in a Wild West saloon would be a miserable experience for a modern person. Everything about it, the food, the environment, the hygiene, the social dynamics, would be unpleasant, uncomfortable, and potentially dangerous. You'd leave hungry, unsatisfied, possibly sick, and definitely grateful that you live in a time with modern restaurants, food safety regulations, and fresh vegetables. So there you have it, the reality of what people ate in Wild West saloons. Not the romanticized version from movies and TV shows, but the gritty, often disgusting truth. The food was cheap, monotonous, and designed primarily to make you thirsty so you'd buy more drinks. The free lunch wasn't free, it was a marketing scheme. The beans were endless and boring. The oysters were a strange paradox, seafood in the desert. The meat was often questionable in quality and origin. The bread was hard and stale. The vegetables were almost non-existent. The hygiene was non-existent. The economics were exploitative. The drinking culture was aggressive and dangerous. But there were also moments of community, of celebration, of people coming together to share what little they had. The ethnic influences added variety and flavor, showing that the West was more diverse than the stereotype suggests. The special occasions provided breaks from the monotony and created memories that sustained people through hard times. But overall, eating in a Wild West saloon was a survival activity, not a dining experience. People ate to stay alive, to have the energy to work, to avoid starvation. They didn't eat for pleasure, for health, or for enjoyment. The food was a means to an end, nothing more. Understanding what people really ate in Wild West saloons gives us a more accurate picture of frontier life. It wasn't glamorous or romantic. It was hard, uncomfortable, and often unpleasant. The food reflected this reality, being cheap, basic, and barely adequate. The next time you watch a Western and see cowboys eating hearty steaks and fresh vegetables in a clean, well-lit saloon, remember the reality. Remember the beans, the salt pork, the stale bread, the filthy conditions, the constant threat of food poisoning. Remember that the real Wild West was a place where simply getting enough to eat was a daily challenge, and where the food you did get was often barely edible. And be grateful that you live in a time when food is abundant, varied, safe, and actually tastes good. Because the alternative, the reality of Wild West saloon food, is something you'd never want to experience. Thanks for watching. Until next time, sleep well.